Hello, welcome to FHE on the Road with Christine Stevenson. This podcast is designed to connect the people and the places from the past with your lives today, with 5-minute stories and facts from church history. Save these stories for when you are traveling through these areas to bring history to life. Okay, welcome back to FHE on the Road with Christine. Today I have the last story of the Oakland Temple that I promised. This is the David O. McKay miracle at the dedication of the Oakland Temple. This is super incredible. I love this story. Hopefully you like it too. The Oakland Temple was ready for dedication in November 1964 when the prophet at the time, President David O. McKay, was in his 90s. President McKay's health was failing, and although members of the church knew of health issues, they didn't know the severity of what was going on with the prophet at the time. President David O. McKay had had a stroke a year before the dedication of the Oakland Temple in 1963, and this stroke had lasting effects on the prophet. He said, quote, "It makes me angry. I have to drag my feet." End of quote. So he was really struggling with what had happened from that stroke. And then President McKay had a second stroke just before the dedication of the Oakland Temple in August of 1964. And this was all referenced out of his biography if you want to check it out. It talks about it in this Oakland Temple book that I have, and they referenced it out of the biography as well. So if you want to check it out, if you ever need to reference it, I will put the link on the blog. He had the second stroke in August of 1964, and he was put on oxygen for several days. Because of the stroke, President McKay had to miss General Conference, and they said it was the first time he had missed General Conference since 1906, and it was 1964. So that was a lot of conferences. It must have been so hard to have to miss that. And he actually had his son read the address that he had prepared. So that would have been interesting to see. So he was very, very sick. The stroke had impaired President McKay's speech and mobility. To the people around the prophet, it seemed as though the prophet was not going to be able to make it to the Oakland Temple dedication. And just to clarify, it is not unusual, especially nowadays, but even back then, it was not unusual to have someone else dedicate the temple, like a member of the First Presidency or the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. That happens all the time. But everyone was looking for that assignment, and they saw the prophet's failing health, and they were wondering what was going on, and they were all wondering who the prophet was going to assign to dedicate the Oakland Temple. However, as the time of the dedication grew closer, the prophet did not make any assignments for others to go and dedicate the Oakland Temple in his stead. Those around the prophet worried about how this was even going to work out. He was just not able to function like he had, and not giving any assignments out there. Like, would he even be able to do it? Everyone was a little bit unsure. I wouldn't say panicked, because he's still the prophet. President McKay decided to make the trip to Oakland himself to dedicate the Oakland Temple against the medical advice of his doctors. So this would be a little bit worrisome. Family and friends and the Quorum of the 12, I'm sure they were a little bit concerned about going against the medical advice of his doctors. But President McKay's health had improved, and I love this. It was attributed to fasting, prayer, and the priesthood blessing that he was given by Hugh B. Brown, Eldon Tanner, and Joseph Fielding Smith. But even with the improvements, President McKay was still not able to talk smoothly or stand without assistance, and a trip to Oakland, California would have been pretty hard on him. So it sounds like people were pretty concerned about what was happening. So President McKay flew from Salt Lake City on November 16th, 1964. His son Edward had packed oxygen and medicine for the flight. The night he arrived in California, they had a press conference, but President McKay had had a hard time speaking, and no decision had been made if he or someone else would dedicate the Oakland Temple. Right up until the end, everyone was pretty concerned on how this was going to happen. At the first dedicatory session, President McKay was brought into the celestial room of the temple in a wheelchair, and President McKay later recorded in his journal what happened on that day, saying, quote, "As I entered the celestial room, tears welled up in my eyes as I looked around at those who'd gathered in the rooms on either side of the pulpit and at the choir members dressed in white. I knew then that our prayers had been answered, and I felt grateful that the Lord had granted me this privilege of being in attendance at the dedication of this beautiful temple." End of quote. President Stone was asked to conduct the services. After several speakers had participated, President Stone stunned the congregation when he announced, quote, "We shall all now have the pleasure of hearing from President McKay." End of quote. Even the children of President McKay were shocked at this announcement. President McKay's son, Lawrence, and daughter-in-law, Mildred, looked at each other in disbelief as the prophet was assisted to the pulpit. President McKay gripped the pulpit with both hands for support. As the prophet began to speak, his son observed, quote, his enunciation became as clear as it had been 10 years before. End of quote. Mildred, the daughter-in-law, was in tears and whispered, quote, we're witnessing a miracle, end of quote. The members of the 12 were weeping, so it was pretty powerful to see the prophet up there. After concluding his remarks, President McKay offered the dedicatory prayer. He said, quote, I stood at the pulpit for over an hour at this time, and I knew the Lord had blessed me as I stood there without any support of any kind, end of quote. The prophet remarked later that when he began to speak, he could feel the power that strengthened his vocal cords. Elder Christensen, a general authority attending the dedication, said, quote, I'm sure that you agree with me that the prayers of the saints had been answered with the presence and participation here of our great leader and prophet David O. McKay. When it appeared to some that he might not be able to be present, it seemed to me that with each successive session he gathers strength and becomes more vigorous and more impressive than ever. End of quote. Elder Hinckley testified, we witnessed a miracle as the mantle of the prophet rested so unmistakably upon him who has been ordained to lead us. I am satisfied that our Father in heaven buoyed up and directed and inspired our president, our leader, our prophet. End of quote. I think that this miracle is so incredible. It's so undeniable that this came straight from our Heavenly Father. President McKay had the desire to dedicate this special building for the saints in Northern California, and the Lord made it possible for him to do that. And I'm so grateful for our Heavenly Father, seeing the needs of the people and the desire to have that prophet, President David O. McKay, be the one to dedicate the Oakland Temple. And the Heavenly Father was literally the only one who could make that possible. What a miracle it would have been to see. Anyways, I really like this story, and hopefully you like it too. Thanks. Thank you for listening to FHE on the road today. We hope you enjoyed what you've heard. Please like, subscribe, and share with anyone who'd be interested in these stories. Thanks.